The loss of color. One morning, the Pig family woke up, and everything in the house seemed strange. Peppa and George noticed that their toys on the shelf looked a little dull, and the bright pictures on the walls had become faded. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual, and the parents didn't pay much attention to it. But by evening, the situation worsened. Mama Pig put a cup on the kitchen table and noticed that it had turned a strange gray color. Daddy Pig put down a newspaper, and it too started losing its bright color, turning into a dull shade. Everything they touched gradually lost its color, as if their world was becoming more and more muted. The next day, when Peppa and George woke up, the whole house was nearly devoid of color. The carpets on the floor, the furniture, even the fruits in the kitchen, everything had turned gray. In the evening, when Peppa looked out the window, she noticed that the trees and the sky had also lost their vibrant hues and became cold and colorless. Even the sun, which usually brought warmth, now seemed dim, as if its light couldn't break through the darkness. Peppa began to worry that something very bad was happening, but Mama and Daddy Pig reassured her that everything would be fine. However, with each passing day, the color in the house disappeared more rapidly. Peppa tried to bring something back into her room, but her toys became increasingly dull, and the books and other things seemed to be fading right before her eyes. One night, Peppa woke up and noticed that the house had become completely dark, even though the lamps were on. She went down the hallway and discovered that even the light in the lamps had become faint and cold. When she reached the kitchen, she saw that even the fire in the fireplace had gone out, and instead of warmth, it gave off only cold. Peppa realized that the disappearance of color wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was something much more terrifying. She went to find her parents, but they looked just as dull as everything else around them. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table, but his face was gray, and he didn't even notice when Peppa approached. As soon as she touched him, everything around them began to disappear again. There was no more sound or light in the house. Peppa felt her own body becoming more and more pale and transparent, as if she too was losing her form. In the final moment, when the entire house was consumed by the gray color, Peppa heard the warm voice of Granny Pig, who explained that this was the result of forgotten joys and clouded memories. When happiness fades from the world, when things no longer bring joy, color begins to disappear. And in the end, everything, even the ones closest to you, becomes consumed by shadow. Peppa tried to find a way out, but everything around her became even more dull, and eventually she disappeared, leaving an empty, colorless space. Everything that had once been bright and alive was swallowed by the darkness. Peppa Pig, the door to darkness. The day was gloomy and quiet. The wind rustled the trees outside, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. Peppa and George were playing in their room, building a tall tower out of blocks. The house felt especially cozy until it started to get dark. When Mummy Pig called them for dinner, Peppa stood up and accidentally knocked over the tower, sending the blocks tumbling to the floor. George whined in frustration, but Peppa wasn't paying attention anymore. She was staring at the corner of the room. There, where there had always been just a wall, now stood a door that had never been there before. It was tall, old, with a black handle. It looked out of place, as if it didn't belong in their house. Maybe Mummy and Daddy built a new storage closet, Peppa thought. But the idea sent a strange chill down her spine. George, forgetting about the fallen tower, also noticed the door and pressed himself against Peppa. Peppa took a step forward. The door was closed, but a cold draft seeped from the gap beneath it. She slowly reached out and touched the handle. It was freezing. And then the door creaked open slightly. Just a tiny bit, but it was enough. From the darkness inside came a soft rustling sound. Peppa and George froze, listening. No light, no voices. Just a faint scratching noise, like something in the shadows was dragging its claws across the floor. Peppa quickly pulled her hoof away. George gripped her dress tightly. And then the door started opening wider. Creak! The darkness behind it was too deep, unnatural, swallowing up all the light. Peppa instinctively stepped back. Then it appeared. Out of the blackness, a hoof slid into view. It looked like hers, but too long, with thin fingers instead of rounded edges. Then a second hoof emerged, and then a face peeked out. It was exactly like Peppa's, but its eyes were pitch black, empty, and its mouth, the mouth slowly stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Peppa screamed and grabbed George's hoof. She bolted toward the hallway door, but then the light flickered. For a split second, everything was swallowed by total darkness, and when the light returned, the door was gone. All that remained was a blank wall, as if it had never existed. George whimpered, clutching Peppa's arm. She breathed heavily, eyes fixed on the spot where the door had been. Everything looked normal, but Peppa knew one thing for certain. It was still here, somewhere, watching. Behind the closed door, night had fallen in Peppa Pig's house. After dinner, she and George went upstairs to their room, changed into their pajamas, and climbed into bed. The evening was just like any other. Mummy Pig came in to say goodnight, turned off the light, and left the door slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of warm light from the hallway to spill into the room. The familiar silence settled in, broken only by George's steady breathing as he quickly drifted off to sleep, curled up under his blanket. A few hours passed. Outside, the sky was completely dark, and pale moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows on the walls. Then Peppa woke up. She didn't know what had stirred her from sleep, but a strange uneasiness settled deep inside her the moment she opened her eyes. The room looked the same as always, stuffed animals in the corner, books neatly arranged on the shelves, the nightlight sitting on the bedside table. But something felt wrong. A chill crept down her spine as she realized what it was. The door. When she had gone to bed, the door had been slightly open, letting the soft glow from the hallway seep in. Now it was shut tight. Peppa slowly sat up in bed, her breath shallow. The door had never closed on its own before. Someone must have pushed it shut. But she hadn't heard any footsteps, no creak of the floorboards, no movement at all. Her gaze flickered toward George, still fast asleep, unaware of the growing fear inside her. She hesitated, then carefully slid out of bed, placing her feet on the cool floor. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, pressing against her like an invisible weight. Step by step, she crept toward the door, barely daring to breathe. She reached for the doorknob, turned it gently, pulled. Nothing. The door wouldn't open. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip, pulling harder this time. The knob didn't even budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. A deep, sickening dread filled her chest. She swallowed hard and pressed her ear against the wood. The hallway should have been quiet. There should have been nothing there. But there was something. She couldn't hear it move, couldn't hear it breathe, but she could feel it. The presence was unmistakable, heavy, cold, and waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then the sound came, a soft, deliberate knock. Once, twice, 3 times. Each knock was slow, calculated, as if whatever was on the other side was waiting for her to respond. Peppa stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The fear was unbearable now, wrapping around her like icy chains. And then it spoke. The voice was hers, exactly hers. Calm, familiar, slightly sleepy, like an echo of herself. But something was wrong. It was too smooth, too measured, too empty. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen. At some point, she swore she saw the doorknob twitch. Just slightly, just enough to let her know it was still there. Without thinking, she turned and rushed back to bed, pulling the covers over her head and squeezing her eyes shut. She knew that if it wanted to, it could come in, but it didn't. The night stretched on, silent and endless. And in the morning, the door was slightly open again, as if nothing had ever happened. Peppa Pig, the others. The evening sky was pale gray. The air was completely still. The pig family was having dinner in silence. The clinking of cutlery, the slow footsteps, the dripping of the tap. Everything sounded louder than usual. After dinner, Mummy Pig washed the dishes. Daddy Pig sat in his chair with the newspaper. George played with his dinosaur near the sofa. Peppa was putting together a puzzle on the floor. The evening felt like it was lasting slightly longer than it should. There was a knock at the door. Once, then again, no doorbell, no voices. Daddy Pig opened it. Standing on the doorstep were them, exact copies of the family, 1-to-1. Mummy, Daddy, Peppa, George, same clothes, same faces, same posture. Something was wrong. Their poses were too still, their expressions too flat. Eyes just slightly too dark, smiles frozen. They didn't speak. They simply stepped inside. No one stopped them. They spread out through the house. The second mummy stood at the sink. The second Daddy beside the chair. The second Peppa sat opposite the real one, moving a puzzle piece slowly back and forth, never placing it. The second George just stood there, glassy-eyed. At first, the real family just watched, as if it were all a mistake. But the copies didn't leave. They stayed, and acted as though they had always lived here. The next morning, it all happened again. Two families under one roof. One breakfast, mirrored movements. But the copies were off, just slightly wrong, always half a second behind, as if mimicking learning. The second Daddy sat in the chair but never turned a page. The second Mummy washed already clean dishes. The second George held the dinosaur upside down and never blinked. The second Peppa stared directly at the real Peppa, unmoving, without emotion. Real Peppa tried to interact, but the other Peppa didn't speak. She only mirrored her like a reflection, a delayed, hollow one. By the third day, the real family began to fade, literally. Their colors dulled, their movements slowed, their voices grew quiet. The mirrors showed only the new family. On the fourth day, the real George was gone. No one looked for him. The second George remained, walking silently through the house, smiling emptily. Peppa realized no one noticed them disappearing. Real Daddy and Mummy were pale, tired, fading like old photographs. The copies now moved with more energy, more clarity. They no longer imitated. They simply existed. On the fifth day, the real Mummy vanished. Only Peppa remained, still bright, still real. She tried to leave. The front door was there, but nothing was behind it. Only solid white light, no road, no sky, no sound. The other Peppa now slept in her bed, wore her clothes, held her toys. The dinosaur rested in the hands of the new George. One night, real Peppa woke to find the other Peppa watching her, from beneath the bed, still, unblinking. After that, there was silence. The new family lived in the house. They laughed, cooked, played. They looked normal, as if they had always been there. But in the cupboard beneath the stairs, behind old boxes and bags, if you look closely, you might see a pale pink shape, sitting quietly, knees to chest. No face, no eyes, no name. It doesn't move anymore. The mysterious shadow. One evening, as Peppa and her family were preparing for dinner, the house started to grow dark faster than usual. Daddy Pig turned on the living room light, but the bulb immediately went out, leaving the room in semi-darkness. Soon, the lights in the whole house started to dim, and Peppa felt that something was wrong. Mummy Pig tried to turn on other lights, but without success. Peppa suggested opening the windows to let in some light, but when they did, there was nothing visible outside. No yard, no familiar trees, just endless darkness. Peppa closed the window, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. Daddy Pig suggested they go outside and see what was happening. But as soon as he opened the door, the entire house was suddenly plunged into complete darkness. Peppa, Mummy, and Daddy stood in the dark hallway, hearing only each other's footsteps and a faint rustling sound. Then Peppa noticed a strange shadow moving across the walls. At first, she thought it was just the play of light, but the shadow became clearer and more unnatural. Peppa tried to call out to her parents, but they didn't respond, their faces empty. The shadow began to move closer, and Peppa felt her heart tighten with fear. She tried to find the light switch, but couldn't remember where it was. At that moment, the shadow appeared right in front of her. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a creature with huge, soulless eyes and a twisted body. Peppa screamed in terror, and at that moment the light flickered back on. The shadow disappeared, as if it had never been there. But Peppa couldn't forget what she had seen. When she returned to her parents, they seemed just like usual, but something about their behavior was strange. They didn't notice how quickly it had gotten dark, nor were they concerned about the lights going out. Peppa decided she had to stay on guard. And though everything returned to normal, at night in her room, she often saw strange shadows sliding across the walls, sometimes moving as though they were watching her. Peppa Pig, the Screen. It was a rainy evening at the Pig family home. Raindrops drummed against the windows and the wind howled through the pipes. Inside, the house was warm and cozy. Peppa and George sat on the floor playing with their toys, while Daddy Pig relaxed on the couch after a long day at work. The television flickered softly, filling the room with familiar sounds. Daddy lazily flipped through the channels, clicking the remote. But something was strange. The image on the screen trembled slightly, as if the TV couldn't focus. Sometimes the sound lagged behind, making the characters' mouths move out of sync. Daddy Pig frowned and tapped the remote against his palm. The screen flickered. At first, just a brief flash of static. Then the picture began to distort. The faces of the news anchors stretched unnaturally, their eyes turning empty, their voices muffled as if coming from deep underwater. Daddy Pig leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Suddenly the television flared with a bright white light. A cold gust of air seemed to rush from it, and the room felt thick and heavy, as if something unseen was pulling everything toward the screen. The couch trembled slightly. Daddy Pig reached for the remote, but his fingers slipped. He tried to pull back, but something was dragging him forward. First, just a little, then with a sudden yank. Peppa and George froze, unable to move. They watched as Daddy Pig was pulled toward the screen. His feet lifted off the ground, his hands clawed at the armrests, his face twisted in terror. It all happened in seconds. The last thing they saw were his outstretched hands, disappearing into the flickering light. Then the TV glitched once more, and a dead silence filled the room. Peppa took a hesitant step forward. George clutched his dinosaur, his breathing shaky. The screen flickered again. And then, movement. A shadow shifted behind the static. A face, pale, distorted, with hollow eyes. It looked like Daddy Pig, but something was wrong. His lips trembled as if he was trying to speak. But instead of words, a low, muffled sound came through, the sound of heavy breathing. The screen flashed one last time before turning completely black. The house fell silent again. Only the rain continued to tap against the glass. Peppa slowly took a step back. The television showed nothing now, but Peppa could feel that it was still watching.